Are you investigating project-based learning? Are you a seasoned PBL teacher or leader? Do you need more PBL resources to help you or your team on their PBL journey? If you answered yes to any of these questions, I have the perfect resource for you. Go to whatispbl.com. At whatispbl.com, you'll be able to choose resources via administrator or teacher, whichever best suits you. So go to whatispbl.com to get those free resources today. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Ryan Stoyer, and I serve as the leader of Magnify Learning, a PBL organization working across the country to bring amazing outcomes to kids. I'm also the host of the PBL Simplified Podcast, where we dive deeper into some PBL ideas. Our big, hairy, audacious goal is to have 51% of schools using PBL by 2051, affectionately known as 51 by 51. We see a better world in the future when the majority of students are graduating purposeful instead of passive. When students, teachers, and principals all know their purpose and they're working in their areas of genius, we think the world's going to be a better place. Thank you for tuning in today so we can help you simplify the PBL process and bring your vision off the page and into your school. On the second Wednesday of every month on the PBL Simplified Podcast, we interview teachers and principals that are in the classroom doing the work. Today, we're doing a deep dive into one of these PBL units that's currently being implemented by one of our facilitators. Today, we have Michelle from Babcock Neighborhood Schools in Florida. Babcock Neighborhood Schools is one of our model schools here at Magnify Learning. We suggest that you go and visit places where PBL is done well, and this is one of them. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know that I advocate for school visits early and often. You can go and see others, see their work they've been working on for decades, and go and glean some of those things. You can talk to facilitators, you can talk to administrators, you can talk to students. You always get a straight answer from students, so we highly recommend you go visit. This is one of those that you should go visit. You should go see BNS in action. Michelle is a high flyer and has been instrumental in the building of the culture at Babcock Neighborhood Schools and the general excitement around PBL that's there. As soon as you walk in, you know things are different. Now, she's a high school biology teacher, but she's also worked with elementary school students at BNS as they've grown. Michelle's a PBL certified facilitator who's a trainer at the Magnify Learning summer workshops. So when you jump into a workshop with Magnify Learning, these are the high flyers that are leading your trainings. It's teachers that are in the classroom currently doing great work. And now we just get to hear one of these examples, one of the PBL units in depth. I think we actually get into two in this particular PBL showcase. Michelle's a great example of the passion and expertise that our trainers bring to a Magnify Learning experience. I hope you enjoy this conversation today, and I hope you share it with your staff members. Like, if you're a principal listening, you're one of those visionary leaders, these are the ones you want to share with your teachers especially. Because then we say, well, what's PBL look like? Is it really something I want to jump into? When you hear the passion, when you hear the impact on learners and these stories, yes, like your staff are going to get fired up. So share this one, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, it is the second Wednesday of the month, so we have a PBL showcase today, as we do every month. And this is a chance for you to get to hear a deep dive with a facilitator in the classroom on what one of their PBL units was like, or maybe multiples. Michelle and I were just talking. So we've got Michelle from Florida. She is at Babcock Neighborhood Schools, which is one of our demonstration sites or a model school. If you want to see great PBL, this is where we would send you. And Michelle's been there for a while, and I'll let her tell Michelle, I want you to tell your story of kind of how you went from high school biology, the conversation we just had off air of like high school biology to like sixth grade, I think, and then worked your way up. So Michelle, really excited to have you here. Why don't you give us a little bit of that background first?
Sure. So this is my my ninth year teaching, and I was teaching at a high school in the area, and I was teaching honors biology, and I just felt there needed to be a change because I was reviewing with my students, and as long as I was sticking to the questions on the paper, they could respond. But if I tried to mix it up and try to get some application out of them, I just got blank stares. And this was my honors kids. So I felt there needed to be a change for education. I felt there was a better way. And then also coming back to relevancy, like why are my students being asked to learn these biological concepts, and really trying to find that relevancy for them. So the administrator who had hired me at that school at the time, she had left that school to open up Babcock Neighborhood Schools. So she left. It was an elementary. It was K through 6 when it started. And then the second year it was open, I applied and I said, I am willing to drop down from being a high school biology honors teacher and teach whatever science position you have open. And I had the interview and I said, I'm doing this in hopes that I get back into high school one day. And so we talked about it and she said, that's fine. The position she had to offer was fourth and fifth grade science, which was like a huge culture shock. So not only was I now learning PBL, but I'm learning how to facilitate with fourth and fifth graders. So it was quite a challenge, but definitely learned about perseverance and determination and growth mindset. So I taught fourth and fifth grade science, and then I taught sixth and seventh grade science, and then I taught 8 and 9, and I finally got back into high school. This is my first year being back in high school without teaching middle school. So I am solely a high school teacher now.
Yeah, that's such an exciting story. And for our listeners that are visionary leaders, and we get a lot of teachers on this particular Wednesday because of the showcase as well. But man, what the power of a great leader, right? Like you will follow a great leader even from high school to elementary, right? And like I was a secondary teacher. I taught middle school, and like elementary, it was like that's a whole nother like foreign world, right? And you did that. Well done.
Thank you. Yeah, it was definitely, I believed in the vision and the mission so much of this school, and the need for change.
Yeah, that's so good. And I love hearing that in your story. It's very evident that there's a tweak that needs to happen, right? If our high performing kids in school, are just getting points and they're not thinking and applying, right? Something's a little off. So it's not, even though it appears to be working, maybe something's off. So it's a courageous step, Michelle. I appreciate that. You've already talked a little bit about your why, but we always kind of start with that question of what's your why. So what would you say is your why for education?
My why really comes back to preparing my students for their next steps. Not to be a good test taker, not to go to college, not to do anything specific, but prepare them for their next steps, whatever that can be. So coming back to what skills are going to make them successful. Those 21st century skills. I hate using buzzwords, but that's one of them. Yep. Making sure that they're creative problem solvers, that they have the resilience when something's not working to tackle it in a different angle, to feel comfortable presenting anything to anyone, any group of people, and just that collaboration piece, working with other people to be able to be successful and problem solve.
And we also get people that come on the podcast who are just like, hey, I want to learn about PBL. So like if you want to learn about project-based learning, like I think Michelle just gave it to you like in a nutshell, right? Like if you think there's something that's a little bit off in education, then you need to keep exploring PBL because that's really what we're after. And that's what we do at Magnify Learning. And that's, these are the schools we want to support, where it's like my own personal story. We've got to get into yours, but I'm just so fired up with the way you started this episode. It's like I was a model student. Like I got a 4.2 as a 3-sport athlete, all the things that I was supposed to do. Graduated, got the engineering job that was high paying. I was supposed to like that. And I didn't like it. I was good at it, but it wasn't like what I was called to do. What I was really called was education. I made that shift. And as I reflect back on that, like I had no idea why I was getting all these points, but everybody kept telling me it was good, right? Like nobody ever said, hey, Ryan, you should think about some of these things. So I just really love your heart, Michelle, and that you're bringing to this. But let's jump into a PBL unit that you want to share. So the PBL showcase is just to say, hey, here's a cool unit and let's walk through it.
Okay. Well, first of all, picking just one was insanely hard to do.
That's fair. And just for our audience, like I've given Michelle some liberty too, to go to a couple if she needs to pull from. So,
well, I'm going to start with probably my most recent one because I'm going to try not to cry, but I had such a cool shift with my kids with this PBL from a student who just really shined through this opportunity. But so I'm a biology teacher and we were getting ready to go to our unit for genetics. And so I pitched a PBL, Rescuing Biodiversity with Genetics. So I challenged my students. We watched a video for our entry event about saving the island fox, and how some biologists noticed that this population was going down with this fox, and trying to identify why and kind of unraveling the story. So they figured out what was causing the species to decline. They addressed that and then decided to bring it back with selective breeding. And so my students watched that. We had some really great conversation. We completed like a ticket as we were going through it to really make sure that we were touching on genetic diversity, that we were talking about conservation efforts, that we were talking about different types of conservation genetic efforts as well. And I do driving questions a little differently. I make my kids do the driving question for me. I always have one in the background to put in there, but I have each student submit a driving question, and then we vote on it as a class, and then we tweak it together to make sure that we're still following all the criteria for a driving question. So what my students actually finalized on was, how can we as conservation geneticists design a genetic management plan so we can increase population numbers of an endangered species and help sustain biodiversity of Florida. So they were really challenged. They had to pick a native species that was imperiled. So we worked with Florida Fish and Wildlife to kind of get a list of animals to choose from. And then we started looking at, okay, well, why is the species in decline? And that all kind of can circle back to human impacts. And so that brought up a really real conversation there. Like, okay, well, we can't do much about that. We can't tell someone to stop polluting. We can't tell somebody to stop building. There's obviously already laws in place. We can't do much more with that. But here's some other ways we can try and tackle it. And so they came up with these genetic management plans where they were evaluating 3 different conservation genetic methods: cloning, genetic engineering, and selective breeding. And they had to come up with a whole plan on how long it would take. So they were looking at a deep dive into these species with their reproduction processes. So I'm pulling in reproduction, so sexual and asexual reproduction. We're talking about mitosis and meiosis, and then they're realizing, well, how did these traits get passed on? Because they kind of realized that they needed to be focusing on a specific trait with genetics. And I said, that's a perfect opportunity. Let's talk about Mendel's laws. Let's talk about complete and incomplete dominance, because they're finding these traits that don't just follow the complete and incomplete dominance. So that's my whole genetic unit right there. And then
yeah. And it's like
recognizing
wrapped up in this real world issue too, right? And
oh my gosh,
I love all of the geeky biology standards that you just like rattled off, right? Because that's what our audience wants to hear, right? Like, yes, project-based learning, but it wasn't like you put up a couple flyers that said save the fox, right? It was like deep inquiry, and like they're making connections with your biology standards, right?
Oh yeah, like we covered 3 major biology standards because they kept asking, like, well, how does this work? How does cloning, how is that different, from genetic engineering and selective breeding? So now we're talking about DNA replication, and protein synthesis. Like it took us, gosh, it had to take us like almost 9 weeks. This was a long PBL, which was kind of hard to keep that motivation going, but there was so much in it and so many different parts of it. It just kind of naturally kept flowing.
And I love that you brought that up. I was just going to ask you how long it took, because our listeners always ask that. Like, right, every time we do a workshop over the summer, it's like, well, how long should my PBL be? And I would just say, if you're brand new to PBL, 9 weeks is probably long. And even heard Michelle say that, right? It's like, it's not that it's inherently wrong. Like, if you have the standards in there and you're using your time wisely, but keeping engagement on one PBL unit for 9 weeks is a difficult thing. So Michelle's been doing this for what, 8 or 9 years now. So like,
oh yeah, PBL's been 5 years.
Yeah. So it's like, you've got experience doing this. So like, when you've got a 9-week PBL unit, there's going to be challenges on the engagement side. So you're going to, you've got some tools in your tool bag to do that. So I love that we get to hear the amount of standards that are in there, like big beefy standards, and that you're also like super cognizant of like keeping that engagement up.
Well, and the crazy thing is I always do a reflection at the end, and it's anonymous so my students can feel that they can speak openly and honestly. And I always ask them about this and what's something that could have improved the PBL. And time again, they always say, we need more time with it. We need more time. And I'm like, if I could give it to you, I would.
Yeah, that's right.
But definitely a balancing act.
Yeah, but I love that you bring that up, like, because there's always a tension there, right? Like, kids are always going to ask for more time. It doesn't mean you have to give it to them, right? Like, you have these standards that you need to engage throughout the year, and you don't get more time at the end of the year because you do PBL, right?
Right.
So you have to kind of work through the tension there. But like, how would you encourage a listener who's like, my PBL got away from me, right? Like, the kids needed more time, so I gave them more, but then I felt like I lost some time. What would your encouragement be for somebody trying to figure out the timing of PBL?
Definitely be proactive. I jokingly call myself a lazy teacher because I make my kids do everything.
Yeah.
So I
It's
definitely
empowering
have
though, right?
it is. And I'm seeing the benefits of how that works with my students. They become much more reflective and take ownership a lot more. But with
Mm-hmm.
timing, especially, I kind of look at how long I would naturally spend on a standard. And then I try to like add a couple days here and there because there are some things that's going to take more time, like launching it and
Mm-hmm.
doing the knows and needs to knows. I definitely take a little longer with my driving question because I want my kids to be exposed to coming up with those questions and being able to mimic that skill. So when they're older, they're good at asking questions and how to do things. Practicing for a presentation. I got a wonderful compliment when my kids were practicing for the presentation for the local university. The external audience members that came, the parents, the teachers, they were astounded that my ninth graders were presenting in this manner. Well, what they didn't know is we'd been practicing for like a week, like tuning protocol on tuning protocol, feedback on feedback on. So I typically, for the timing, I have a ballpark of how many weeks it would take for me to cover a standard, and then I add a few classes here, like onto that. And then I give it to my kids and I say, okay, guys, um, we know what the final product is. It's launched. What steps do you guys need to complete this final product? So I already have my benchmarks mapped out, but I kind of guide the conversation so that they're identifying their own benchmarks. And then once they do that, I say, okay, well, in order to do this, how long do you need? Like, how long do you need to research your species? Because that's the first step. And that's what they tell me. And then I say, okay, well, the next thing you need to do is identify like the real problems. How long do you need to identify the problems with your species? And they always tell me, like a class, 2 classes. I said, okay, cool. And so my students actually do a lot of setting when those benchmarks are due. And again, I've already done it on my end, but that's how I'm getting my student buy-in.
Right. And that's
Because
super strong,
yeah.
right? That, like, you want your learner, if you think about like a graduate profile, like, what do we want our learners to leave our high school system with as they go into college, the workforce? Like, the ability to set your own timelines and to be able to problem solve that is huge, right? Like, the agency that's involved in that is such an awesome skill that goes beyond biology, right? It spills into history, it spills into math, it spills into
Yeah.
everything that they do in the school world. And then likely then, because they've used that muscle now, spills into their adult world. And gosh, I feel like I could use a workshop on that, right? So like, what a leg up. So I love that you're working those things in. Our listeners are probably going to want you to workshop that with us sometime. So we can't do that right now. But so let's go. How about community partners in this PBL unit, and then maybe end product? Like, how did they finish up?
So, and this kind of ties into my story about A&E.
Yeah.
Our community partner, Fish and Wildlife, helped with getting the list for us about local native Florida species that needed some saving. And then we have a local university that partners with us quite a bit. And so I reached out to some conservation geneticists there and said, would you listen to our students present their findings? Because I know these are real life problems that you're tackling. And uh, while this one didn't quite culminate into as much impact as another PBL I wanted to talk about, there was still that authenticity where they're presenting to experts in the field. So I'm going to kind of try to structure my thoughts here. So knowing that my students got to go to FGCU, I have a student, her name is Annie, and that's not her real name, but we're going to call her Annie.
Yep.
She's autistic and she struggles speaking in class and in front of people. She'll come up to me and talk to me all day, but even a Socratic seminar or asking a question in class it's too much for her sometimes to be able to do. Oftentimes when she's very frustrated or overwhelmed, she even resorts to being nonverbal and will just type on a document to communicate with me. And so we launched this PBL. And she was in the back of my mind because going up to complete strangers at a university, how terrifying. Well, she came up to me and she said, I'm really worried about who's going to be in my group. And I said, okay, well, why are you worried about who's in your group? She said, well, I'm afraid they won't let me do the species I want to do. And I really struggle with group work and I let things get to me. And I said, well, we can work through all that. And she's like, okay, well, I also really want to make sure I get a good group because I want to go. I'm going to try not to cry. Hold on. I want to go and I want to share about this species and I want to provide a solution for this species. So here's a girl who won't even ask a question in class, who is asking for help and skills so that she can go in front of authentic audiences and present about something she's passionate about. And so that's probably why I picked this PBL to showcase.
Yeah,
because
right.
that just moved me so much. And you know that story of the starfish that you throw it back and everyone's like, well, there's a beach covered in them and you're never going to get all of them. Well, no, I'm not going to reach every single starfish, but I definitely just reached that one.
Yeah, that's right, man. I've got goosebumps on that one. That's such a good story. And if you would have done, a research paper or you maybe did do a research paper and a unit test, right? But Annie doesn't get to respond to that, right? So when you do you can still do the research paper, you can still do the unit quiz, but when there's that authentic audience, like, hey, I get to actually speak for this species, like to help this species that I'm passionate about. Now Annie has a chance to like you said, ask for help and like she's growing, right? And it wasn't like so many times, like, we're developing an IEP or this 504 plan to help this student. And here the student is helping herself because she's got this really neat goal that she wants to achieve. Man, what a win.
I tell you what, I had so many students in this PBL that came up to me, and I've never had a student ask for so much help in my life or so many because they wanted to go. They found an animal they were super passionate about and they wanted to show there's a solution. And they worked so hard to include all kinds of information to really give their presentation some substance, like, hey, I'm knowledgeable. I know what I'm talking about, like forcing them to listen to them.
Yeah, that's really good. And that's inquiry. Like people ask me all the time, like, hey, can you present on inquiry? Or can you tell us more about inquiry and inquiry-based learning, all these different ideas. And sometimes we get stuck on on the teacher asking the question, like, how can I improve my inquiry? And it's like, you have inquiry when your learners are asking questions, right? That's really the goal, is you've got these engaged learners that are looking for new insights into, your content standards. Gosh, that's exciting. You had
it was pretty awesome.
Yeah, it is pretty awesome. I'm excited about that one. You had another one that you wanted to talk about as well. Did you want to touch on that?
So I did. I really got lucky with this group. So these ninth graders, I've looped with them several years. They started as my fifth graders. I got them in sixth grade. I got them in eighth grade. I have them again in ninth grade. So they're pretty awesome. But we were doing
sorry, I keep wanting to interrupt because your story is just so great. And I want to keep pulling out these nuggets. It's like, those learners are awesome, but you guys have an awesome culture at Babcock that like allows kids to be awesome, I think, right? And more than just like grades. It's not like, hey, I've got these good grades, so I'm awesome, or I don't have good grades and I'm not awesome. It's like you guys have a culture that's like looking at the whole student, the whole learner.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that they can grow and flourish in this way and be awesome. Like you just mentioned, like some people are like, I know we've got some teachers that I've worked with and like looping with some kids 4 times is like a nightmare. But it's like, right. But you're loving it because you guys have this culture that's been built by teachers for learners, supported by administration, that allows these things to flourish. So I just wanted to pull that 100%. Out. Yeah, so good.
Yeah, 100%. And kind of speaking to that and to PBL, these are kids that have been learning PBL with me and being very gracious when I make mistakes and actually pausing and like telling them, okay, guys, I messed that up. Let's try it again. But these are also the kids that can present to anybody. Like I had one person say, wow, I've listened to like juniors and seniors do presentations, and these freshmen can present circles around them. And that goes back to those skills they're learning. I mean, it's nothing for me to pull one of my ninth graders without prompting and say, hey, come talk to these strangers about our school or what you're learning, or literally any topic. And they've got it. They can stand up and they can talk. And anyway, that's a rabbit trail. I'll talk about that later.
Yep.
The other PBL I did want to talk about, these eighth graders we're looking at force and motion, and we live in a community that's just growing, and it's going to be incorporating into its own town in the future. And one of the needs they noticed is that we didn't have public transportation. And they may have noticed it because I was using a lot of public transportation and telling them lots of stories. So they kind of made the connection. Well, we don't have that here. And so we were talking about force and motion and how that works. And we kind of came up with, well, what if we designed, we made some suggestions about public transportation to this environment. Well, and then we pull in force and motion. I said, that's fine. We can pull in force and motion with it. And they wanted to present it to the community. And so they had to come up with innovative, sustainable forms of public transportation. They had a lot of freedom with that one. And they ended up getting the powers that be within the community to come and listen to them. And I didn't know that they were going to do this, because this was more of like a PBL that wasn't planned as much as some of my other ones, because it kind of was born out of curiosity from my students.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, well, I've got an authentic audience, then that'll be great. Well, the people who came to listen, she emailed me afterwards. She's like, your kids did a great job. Can you send me all those presentations? Because we're actually meeting about public transportation, and I want to take this to the board, and I'll let you know which idea they take. So that was a really cool final product that kind of blossomed into a real problem that they were able to address.
Yeah, that's so good. And that's another way to come up with a PBL unit, right? Is you can go off your learners, and then you're like, we're going to work in these standards. Right? And just to mention for our listeners, if you're new to PBL, like, again, maybe an advanced move, like in a training, we would start with standards and then build it out. But once you get this and your kids get it, right, it's a different idea. Now you can come with this authentic idea, a real world problem. You've got the community partners that are bringing real world problems, and your kids are problem solvers. Like, why wouldn't we solve this? Like, it's just so good. Like, just good for the world. And, I can hear you getting emotional in this one too, right? It's like, because your kids are like in the real work, and people are legitimately like calling you back and saying, hey, I need those ideas. Like, we have this meeting, and right, like, they're going to be implemented. Like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was fascinating for a lot of my students who are very hands-on, because they had to build prototypes. And I had students who, I mean, you couldn't get them to do anything, nothing. Couldn't turn in anything. Yeah. And suddenly they're not missing a deadline, and they're getting stuff done, and they're asking to come and see me outside, like when they have a research class. Hey, can I come in and work with you? Because I need to do this, because I want them to pick my idea.
Yeah. Yep. Gosh, this is so good. Because you guys, I mean, I would also say, like, listeners, like, as you hear these just awesome stories, sometimes people wonder, like, well, what's their student population? Like, where are they at? And you have a student population that offers some challenges. And I don't know your guys' numbers off the top of my head, but you're working with some kids that are seeing the opportunities you're presenting, and they're taking advantage of them, because they might not have those opportunities otherwise. And what a gift. Just what a gift for those kids to be able to do real work now while they're supported, to have some failures, right? And to have somebody in front of the classroom, probably the side and the back of the classroom too, I'm sure you're all over, to admit that it's okay to fail, right? And then what do? You try again. Like, so you're demonstrating this perseverance for your learners, and obviously they're picking it up. Super exciting. What if there are some teachers or principals that are listening that are maybe on the fence about PBL, because you didn't start in a PBL environment, right? So
I did not.
So what kind of advice would you give them as maybe a first step, or some thoughts of as they think about dipping their toe in or moving forward?
Oh gosh. Well, it's a process. It's definitely not something I feel like you can get overnight. And you need to be resilient in wanting to do it. So I think just honestly, what I would suggest is reading your book that just launched recently, PBL Simplified, because even 5 years in, I'm reading that, and I'm still getting so many great things. And I feel that it really helps clarify the process, and it kind of helps clarify what PBL is all about. And then, yeah, just I would talk to people who do it and kind of get a feel and see the excitement and see the good, the bad, and the ugly that goes with it.
Yeah, that's great. And the process is important. I appreciate you brought that up, and I'm glad that the book's helping too. That's the idea. And because I get to hear a lot of different stories, so then it's like, how can we bring the process in and help people out? So I think process makes a lot of sense. We'll give that to our listeners, and then go see it. And don't expect perfection, right? It's like everybody's in process. So, Michelle, any last thoughts as we close this PBL showcase?
No, I think we about covered it. Everything I wanted to make sure to say anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us. Loved hearing your stories. If you want to go down and see Babcock Ranch in action, if you want to go see Michelle's class, you can do that. Let us know at Magnify Learning. Just reach out to me and we'll set that up. We love to send folks down there. If you want to see PBL done well, that is easily a great place to do that. So, Michelle, thank you for your great work. PBL Simplified listeners, thank you for tuning in. Share this PBL showcase with somebody. Like, somebody that's on the fence, somebody that needs to hear this, someone who's a passionate educator that is trying to reach their students in a new way. It's like, how do I do that? Like, PBL could be that answer. This is a great case study, a PBL showcase to share with them. So please do that. As you do that, you'll engage your learners, tackle boredom, and transform your classrooms. Go lead inspired. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the PBL Simplified Podcast. I appreciate you. I'm honored that you tune in each week. Would you please take 2 minutes to leave a rating and a review? When you leave a review, it lets the next person know that this is a podcast worth listening to. When they go into their player and search project-based learning and PBL Simplified popped up, when they see those reviews, they know that high-quality visionary leaders are listening. So they tune in too, and they can find their way into the PBL journey. Thank you so much for leaving a review. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you.